This lecture is the second part of the Nixon lecture. This lecture is why he quit. He got reelected in 1972, um, and he won by a huge margin, but there's a reason he won. He was really going to do some things in this election that would get him in trouble later on. So let's talk about it. Nixon, as I said before, is universally almost commended and appreciated for what he did in opening up Russia and China for the United States. Same with Henry Kissinger. But what he was not, and for ending the war in Vietnam, although it was kind of sneaky and tricky the way he did that. But he was sort of a paranoid person, and he believed he had enemies everywhere, in schools and in the press, and he didn't even trust some of the people who worked for him eventually. So he created an enemies list of politicians and reporters and people in Hollywood, people in big business, and he kept this list of people he thought were his enemies, both political enemies and personal enemies. He began to wiretap telephones of some, meaning put listening devices in the telephones of some of his own staff members because he didn't trust them, and he also had a group named the Plumbers. The Plumbers were a nickname of a group that Nixon hired to investigate his enemies. So that all seems weird, and it is, because Nixon, while on one hand was this sort of visionary who looked at the world and saw America increasing its influence and also creating peace opportunities, he was also crazy at the same time. One of the things the Plumbers did was they broke into private offices of the enemies and found files and copied files. He created something called the Committee to Re-elect the President when he was running for re-election in 1972, known as CREEP, unfortunately. They worked. But one of the things that they did was one of the guys who was running against him. They leaked a memo claiming that a Democratic presidential candidate had insulted local citizens and had an alcoholic wife. These were known as dirty tricks and forced that guy out of the race, and were only half-truths, if not outright lies. The thing that really signaled the end for Nixon was something known as the Watergate break-in. There's this really neat hotel on the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. called the Watergate, and it's part of it's a hotel, part of it is offices. At that time, the Democratic National Committee, the committee that controlled the Democratic Party, which is the party that opposed Nixon, he was a Republican, they had their headquarters inside the Watergate. And one night, a security officer caught 5 men trying to tap the phones at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The FBI came in. They traced the money that the men were paid for back to the Committee to Re-elect the President as creep, and a big investigation started. The president asked the CIA to ask the FBI to not investigate this matter anymore. This all came out later. But that didn't work. Nixon's advisors spent hundreds of thousands of dollars bribing people to be quiet and not give information about these 5 men who were found. So it was getting very ugly. And because of all this money they were bribing people with, the investigation was barely started before he was reelected. He was reelected in a landslide. And then things began to fall apart for Richard Nixon as the investigation turned into a scandal and people began to find out about it. And their 2 particular reporters broke the story. All the people who were involved in the break-in were found guilty. And these 2 reporters from the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, they began to investigate this, and they had a top secret informant who was giving them information. It drove Nixon crazy because he didn't know who was giving these guys the information. One of the 5 who was arrested decided he was going to testify before Congress. John Dean, who was the president's legal counselor, a lawyer, he testified that the president was personally involved in the cover-up. His own lawyer said that he was personally involved in the cover-up. And it was at this point that it was revealed that all phone calls, all meetings, and all conversations that happened in the president's office, the Oval Office, were recorded. Now, if it happens in the White House and it happens and the president is involved, who works for the people, all those recordings by law are property of the United States Senate and the people of this country. So, a special prosecutor was appointed to investigate the scandal. He demanded all the tapes from Nixon, who refused to give them up, and Nixon tried to fire him. Well, this was pretty embarrassing, and a lot of people began to resign. A lot of people began to get fired, and it was known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Eventually, a new special prosecutor was appointed. He also demanded the tapes. And at the same time this was going on, people were trying to get these secret tapes from Nixon. The Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew, was being investigated for tax evasion, for not paying his taxes, and for bribery or extortion. He had to resign, and Nixon replaced him with Gerald Ford. You picked someone to replace him. The House of Representatives voted to impeach the President of the United States. And when an impeachment happens, there's a vote that happens in the House. The House of Representatives votes, he's impeached, but he's still in office. This is why Clinton got impeached but did not leave office. After the vote happens in the House, a trial happens in the Senate, and all the senators are the jury. And if they find the president guilty, he has to quit. Before that can happen, before they can charge him that he's charged with misconduct, before the trial can go to the Senate, before any of that can happen, Richard Nixon resigned. He releases all the tapes from the White House of that era, except for 18 and a half minutes, which was completely erased, and nobody to this day knows what was on those 18 and a half minutes. But it was obvious and clear that the President of the United States was personally involved in covering up a crime. He decided to resign. There he is getting on Air Force One for the last time. Gerald Ford was sworn in. Remember, he was not elected vice president. He was chosen vice president when the elected vice president, Spiro Agnew, quit. He is the first president in the history of the United States who was non-elected. But he decided, for good or bad, that this country needed to get over this whole Nixon thing, and he pardoned Richard Nixon. There would be no trial for corruption or trial for crimes for Richard Nixon. He was pardoned by the President of the United States. That's a choice he made. Some people say it was bad. Some people say it was good. But anyone else who was involved in the crime was not pardoned, including John Dean, the guy who blew the whistle on the president. All those guys went to jail. The president got off free. During Gerald Ford's very brief presidency, 3 years, he inherited the worst economy since the Great Depression. So he supported increasing unemployment benefits and a huge tax cut to get money in more people's pockets. He was constantly at odds with the Democratic Congress. He controlled the White House, a Republican, but the Congress was controlled by Democrats. In foreign policy, he passed something called the War Powers Act, which says that after 48 hours, the president must explain to Congress why troops were deployed into Vietnam, Korea, the War on Terror, anything. The president had to go within Congress within 48 hours and explain it. Troops cannot be deployed for over 60 days without Congress's approval. This was created to avoid another Vietnam, and Congress can demand that the troops come home. So we'll talk about how President Bush got around the War Powers Act after the 9/11 tragedy. Ford signed something called the Helsinki Accords. These were a series of treaties on European security to sort of help tighten the relationship between the United States, Canada, Russia, 30 other countries. He continued the SALT talks on reducing the number of nuclear weapons and testing. And the next lecture will be about Jimmy Carter, who beat Ford in the next election in 1976.